reason why I said earlier, too, Augustine introduces some Platonic notions without being a full-on Platonist himself. He was for a time, but he converted out of it when he became a Christian. But some of this stuff seems kind of like Plato or Plotinus. So non-being. For the Greeks, for Plato and Plotinus, that was matter, right? All the way at the bottom. That stuff's naughty. It's bad. Remember Plato said, the body's the problem. We're trying to escape from the prison house. And Augustine says, okay, they're onto something. The soul, the animus, is better than the body, but God created the body as good. He created Adam out of the dust. Literally, the name Adam in Hebrew just means dust, dirt. Adam made him out of dirt. You're good. Good. Very good. So the physical body can't be bad. It's been corrupted by sin, but so is everything else. And that's why we can talk about things being bad now. But the body, the physical world itself, is not bad. So it's a little bit above this. So bodies are up here somewhere. They're kind of on the bottom of the scale. They're not as good. The spirits are better. And then God's at the top. God's got the most being. So that's why angels are awesome. Angels are almost better than us in a way. Why? Because they're higher up on the scale. Not because bodies are bad, but because spirits are better. Your soul is more important, and matters of your soul are more important than your body. Which is why Augustine says some things in The City of God, his big book, that might surprise you. Like he says, look, he talks about harmony with non-Christians, for example, where he says, how do you get to heaven? You're a Christian, period. If you have neighbors that are not Christians, they're probably going to go to hell when they die. Okay? That's going to happen. That doesn't mean you can't work with them now. Okay? The highest things are the most important things, sure, matters of faith. But that's not something you can just persuade someone about in a regular conversation. Yes, you should do your best to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ. Sure, Augustine agrees. But while we're here on now, the stuff on earth matters. Stuff that spiritually is more important. But right here, while we're doing stuff, we can do things together with people that are not Christians. He says that in his book, City of God, which kind of becomes a rubric for some of the Middle Ages until Aristotle gets reintroduced. But so this is Augustine in a nutshell. Pseudo, we'll talk about that in a moment. Dionysus, which is just that's just the Latin form of Dennis. Dionysus or Dionysius, I'm cool with either one. Some different pronunciations there. Subtitle, sometimes you get the nickname. Area, right. Gate. And his successor of sorts, John Scotus Erigena. And let me just give you some dates. Pseudo-Dionysus, probably about 6th century CE. There's some debate. We don't know. That's part of the pseudo. And then Scotus Erigena, there we do have dates. He's about the same time as Al-Farabi, honestly. Contemporaneous. So what do these two have in common? And they're distinct, but I can kind of put them as a package deal. What do they have in common? Well, remember how I said Augustine introduced some Platonic ideas into Christianity? At least, and maybe Neoplatonic and Platonic terminology. Okay, like the forms and stuff like that. I'm convinced that Dionysus here and Erigena are full-on Neoplatonists. Just with Christian flavoring added. Okay, but in their own day, they're like Christianity, really, they don't really see a distinction between what Christianity teaches in the Bible and what Plato and Plotinus taught. This is further compounded by the confusion that this person, Dionysus, that wrote these texts, that basically have a thesis that says what Plato said and what Christianity said are basically the same thing. You'll notice, what do I have in front of, and I put it parenthetically, what do I have in front of Dionysus? Pseudo. What does pseudo mean? Yup, that's exactly right. Literally, that means like fake name. Like, it's not the real name, but you know who it is, and it's not meant in some negative way. So what's going on here? And you notice it says Dionysus the Areopagite. So first of all, we need to investigate that. What is the Areopagus? It's a place in Athens. The Areopagus, that's where apparently Aristotle would go teach, Plato would go teach. Socrates was out there. That's where Socrates was making people mad. However, who else was there? A Christian figure. Paul. That New Testament guy. In the book of Acts, chapter 17, he goes to Athens. Men of Athens, I hear you are very religious. And it even says there, he's talking to Stoics and Epicureans. I brought that part up before. But apparently while he was there, even the Stoics and Epicureans say, you idiot. And they kind of just dismiss what he's saying. It's said there, you're bringing strange things to our ears with all this Christianity talk. Nevertheless, someone from Athens converts to Christianity. And this person is named as Dionysus. There in the book of Acts. Many centuries later, though, about the 6th century Common Era, someone is writing this stuff on Neoplatonic philosophy as though taking on the name of that person. Like, I was the person that was there in the 1st century with Paul. I'm that convert. Now, I don't think this was intended as some big hoax. That happens a lot in the ancient world where people will write as someone else, and it's not meant to be disingenuous. So he's not going out of his way to say, no, this really happened this way. However it's intended, people take it later, they read this and go, hey, this is that guy from the 1st century. It's actually this guy from the 6th century, but they take it as though this was the guy from the 1st century. So that means all the stuff he's saying about Plato and Plotinus, well, this guy is one of the earliest Christians. He was literally converted by Paul. What he's saying must be authoritative, surely. And that's part of the reason why, whether this was intentional or not, it becomes a very Neoplatonic flavor to Christianity from about the 6th century until about the 13th century. Strongly Neoplatonic. What do I mean by that? Well, what I was saying about the mind of God, and we participate in even stuff that Peter says about we are become partakers of the divine nature. That word partake that he uses there, that Peter uses, is the same word Plato uses to talk about things participating in the forms. So there's a sense in which what we need to do. And also, remember, Socrates said, or not Socrates, well, Socrates. Plato said, what we really need to do is remember the forms. That's what we need to do. But also recognize that, at least in this physical world, there's certain things that we cannot know. We got the scale in place, right? Being and non-being. That's not going anywhere. But here's what you should know. What's the word for being? Substance or essence? Because in Latin, the same word usia, being, is substantia or essentia. It changes over time. Oh, here's the deal. And you can use either one of these, really. The later you get, the more essence becomes prevalent. Where's God on that list? And you might think, well, he's at the top. And this is the thing that's new. He's not on the list. God is not an essence. Because this is almost its own little field here. God's outside this. He's not an essence. He's a super essence. At least that's how it's usually translated. I think even here, like trans essence might be better. That is to say, it's outside of the scope of what you normally think of it as. Well, what's a super essence like? It's like everything, in that it has really almost kind of infinite qualities. You can never know what it's like. God is, and in fact, and this is sometimes called the via negativa, which means like the way of negation. You say what God is not. And that's really only the knowledge of God that you can possess. Is God this table? Is God this chair? Well, obviously not. But you keep adding these things up. Those are the things that God, you determine what God is by what God is not, because God can never truly be apprehended in himself. What? It's beyond comprehension. It's beyond all understanding. But it's beyond understanding not merely in some inexplicable way. This is literally explaining how it can't be comprehended. God's not an essence. He's a super essence. So we can only know him through, the Greek term would be agnosis. So gnosis is the word for knowledge. So this is, he can only be known through unknowing. Ooh, the Latin word is nescience. Because the Latin word, whereas the Greek word for knowledge is gnosis, the Latin word for knowledge is scientia. That's where we get our word science. So, how do you know God? By knowing what he's not. You need to unknow in order to know. Does that sound mystical? Yes, because it is. Okay, remember, and there's this thread in, I guess we could say religion generally, where what mysticism is a reliance on not the overtly rational. That doesn't mean it's irrational, but we can definitely say non-rational. What do I mean by that? By irrational, I mean intentionally going against rationality. Now throw thinking out the window. By non-rational, I mean people would say this is something, it's not within the scope of reason. It's outside it, it's beyond it. So you know by not knowing. And what did Socrates do, by the way? What did he keep going around saying? I know one thing, and that's that I don't know. What a wise man. Because if someone says, oh, well, God is like this, and he's like this, and they're doing this through their own kind of speculation. Now, that's what the scriptures teach. That stuff is stuff revealed by God himself, so that's not speculative. If people say they know that God is like this or like that, oh, no, because you can have no really knowledge of the infinite one. The one is beyond all understanding. Well, now, who does this sound like? Plotinus. Because it is. It's totally channeling Plotinus. So this thing is the one. Tohe, the divine, the fount of all being. We kind of share in this being as well. What does Pseudodiagnosis say? We must dare to say, even this on behalf of the truth that the cause of all things himself, by his beautiful and good love for all things, through an overflowing of loving goodness, becomes outside himself by his providential care for all beings, and as it were, charmed by goodness, affection, and love, and is led down from his place above all and transcendent of all to dwell in all things in accordance with his ecstatic, super-essential power, which does not apart from itself. So what does he say there? Everything's made out of God, without God depleting in his nature. It's not like all right, I'm going to make stuff in the world, and I'm going to make it out of myself. He doesn't deflate in the process. That's exactly what Plotinus said about the one. So there's a sense, in this view, that when God created the world, did he make it out of some pre-existent stuff? No. Did he make it out of nothing? No, he made it. The universe is made out of God. That means you are too. As Plotinus taught. You don't see that in the book of Genesis. So are you noticing the very heavy Neoplatonic flavor here? Yeah. Very strong. Here we see Christianity like the main vehicle, if you will, even the church itself, really take on this character. Then, following Pseudodiagnosis, well, remember, if he's saying these things, and he was one of the people there with Paul, surely Paul taught him this stuff. That's the idea that's prevalent. Surely Paul taught him this stuff, and this is the original Christianity stuff here. So Erigena, following this, says, surely, he becomes like the biggest Dionysus fan ever and tries to really promote this view of Christianity. And he does this in a time in Western Europe where things were not going so well. There was a lot of feuding, a lot of fighting. Charlemagne's doing his thing. Okay, so there's lots of, little Frankish kings are all fighting each other. He's in Ireland, kind of on the outskirts of, at the time, at the outskirts of Europe. Okay, trying where there's like just a little bit of Latin learning still around. And what does he do? Well, he tries to make Pseudodiagnosis a little more palatable. Yeah, there's a lot of mysticism in there. And he's right. The scale is right. But there's some other things that we need to talk about and some other distinctions that we need to make. Especially when it comes to this notion of substantia. So sure, there's that super essence. Okay, great. But really, we need to review this scale. There are only 4 things on the scale, from being to not being. So let's work our way from the top to the bottom. So what do you got at the top of the scale? God. Deus, as he would say in Latin. What makes God so special? He does this. He creates, but he is uncreated. He creates, but he's uncreated. But that's as good as you can possibly get. The best stuff is like that. That which creates, but it is itself not yet created. Then after that you have the divine ideas. What is this? The mind of God. These are the forms. They're the next, notice this, they're the next best thing on the list. The ideas, that is the forms in God's mind. What's so great about them? Well, they create. They're responsible for creating, like God's ideas in his mind. They are responsible, but they are also themselves dependent on God. They create, but they are created. Now I said, no, they're eternal, but they're still dependent or contingent on God. So you might be thinking, wait a minute, I thought you said God didn't make up this stuff. He didn't. But they still depend on God's eternality for them to work. So they create, but they were created. What's next on the list? Stuff. Substances. We'll just say things. What do I mean by that? Really, physical things. Substances. A chair, table, you, trees, the sun, the moon, the star. Physical stuff. What's cool about them? They are entirely created, and they do not, I guess we could say non-creative, they do not create. Physical things do not create. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, I can make things. I'm creative. This is part of a theme in Neoplatonism, and we don't really think of this today. Like, remember when you were in elementary school, one of the things you were encouraged to be was what? Creative. If you went back to this time in Christianity, this is not true for all time in Christianity, at least for this chunk of time, it's kind of a heretical notion. You're not creative, God is. Did it in 6 days. You don't make anything. Not that way. Can you make something out of yourself? No, I painted a picture. That's great. God created a universe. What are you doing? So creation, it was always considered to be something that's something God does. Well, I'm very creative. No, you're not. Now, this is going to change in the Renaissance. There's this explosion of this idea that human beings can be created in this way. But that's later. We're not there yet. So physical things cannot create. Now, I will say this. We can fashion. We can make things out of other things. But can we make matter? Is matter created? Can matter be created or destroyed? No. Not insofar as we're aware.
What about mental creativity?
What about it?
Creating with your mind a story, for example.
Okay.
Is an idea, a thought.
Well, see, if there's a story out there to be told, it's already there in God's mind. So if you're like, I've got it, Eureka! No, you don't. You're just remembering some idea that's already there. Okay, so what's at the bottom then? So physical things. What would be next? Nothing. What do? Well, it's great. They are uncreated, or nothing is a thing that's uncreated, and it does not create. There you go. That's as low as you can go. Now also, so why did he put it on the list? Well, I'll go back to a little bit of something that you see in Augustine too, is this notion of, here's for us, mouse. We see it in English, we see it in big spicy English words like maleficent, malicious, malevolent. What does it mean? Bad, but like really bad. Okay? Like, what does it mean to be malevolent? Evil. As opposed to benevolent, because the Latin word for good is bonus. What is evil then? So there's really another overlay that we can put on this same scale. Yeah, we got the being scale here, but we can also have another layer over it, a goodness scale. What's good? God, of course. God is the best thing. But Augustine said a little bit about this. But Augustine also said this. What is evil? Malus. Evil is nothing. And Augustine said evil is a privation. So evil is the absence of good. It's not a thing. Yeah, sin is a thing. Evil is not a thing. But evil is not a thing. You can't find, is this thing evil? Is there evil inside it somewhere? Evil is not inside people either. Yeah, we can talk about people being evil, but it's not like something you can find on the inside. It's not a thing. It's not a substance. What is it? It's the absence of goodness. Just like darkness is not a thing. It's the absence of light. Just like cold is not a thing. It's the absence of heat, which is just molecular motion. Right? So what's evil? Nothing. It's not a thing. Now, here, that's something Augustine said. He said evil is a privation. That means it's a lacking of something. What these guys do, we see it here in Erigena too, is, yeah, but you don't know what else is not a thing? There's a sense in which that which is attached to the material. Now this is going back to Plato and Plotinus. It's not that, matter's good, but there's almost like a little bit of that Platonic stuff coming back. The body's bad. Well, I mean, the Bible says the body's good, but it's kind of bad too. Right? So the body is what causes us to be evil. Now that's here in Neoplatonism. I want to stress again, if we go back to some original Christianity stuff, you don't see that there. You do see it here. So like Jesus said, it's not what you put into a man that defiles him, but what goes out. Things you say can make you mess. So it's not like something's intrinsically wrong with the body. That's not just Genesis 1 and 2. You also see that in the New Testament. But here, bodies are bad. Kind of. Why? Because at least they're lower on the scale. There's almost nothingness. Evil is almost like a gravity that weighs us down and keeps us here focused on terrestrial things. Let's move on to my next thinker that I want to talk about. Onset. In many ways, he is a Neoplatonist as well, but it's much more subtle. That Neoplatonic flavor has simmered. And so what he does is, first of all, he writes this book called Monologia, which just means monologue, just me talking. And in this book, it's like one big conversation to God, and it's really technical. So then he writes this other book, Proslogia, which means instead of like a person talking like a monologue, it means like a talking to. And what is he doing here? Who's he talking to? He talks to God. In fact, the whole book, Proslogia, and it's in the text. Come now, insignificant mortal. He's really talking to himself there, though. Like, just as an aside, like, come now. Anselm, I'm bringing you on a journey. What are we doing? We're talking to God. But that leads into the question. And so this whole thing is a prayer that's a meditation to God, about God. So what he wants to do here is figure out what God is. And so the whole opening chapter 1 here is relatively long. And by relatively long, I mean a page. Okay, so these chapters are very, very short. And he starts by talking about his own, it really kind of starts with his own problem of, I'm a sinful man, like Augustine said. I have a hard time understanding things because of my my humanity. You are so high, but I am so low. He says this is on 431, but it's still part of chapter 1. Teach me how to seek you and show yourself to me when I seek. For I cannot seek you unless you teach me how. Because God's beyond, right? As these guys had said. And I cannot find you unless you show yourself to me. Let me seek you in desiring you. Let me desire you in seeking you. Let me find you in loving you. Let me love you in finding you. I acknowledge, Lord. This is also something that's common now in the Middle Ages, to refer to God as Lord. In Latin, Dominus, like to dominate, or dominion. That's the Latin word for it. But if you ever see someone talking to it, there's a case in Latin that we don't have in English called the vocative case. So if you're talking to somebody, their name changes. So you might say Domine, like looking at somebody. You really like you, Lord. So Dominus, Lord, I need your help. But in the Middle Ages, it becomes common to think of God is like a feudal lord, because we're in feudalism, so God's like that. He's like our Lord. He's the provider of, like, just like we're the serfs, and our Lord takes care of us. God's the Lord over us here, in this medieval sense. I acknowledge, Lord, and I thank you. Thank you that you have created me in this image of you, that I may remember you, think of you, and love you. Yet this image is so eroded by my vices, so clouded by the smoke of my sins, that it cannot do what it was created to do unless you renew it and refashion it. I am not trying to scale your heights, Lord. My understanding is in no way equal to that. But I do long to understand your truth in some way, your truth which my heart believes and loves. For I do not seek to understand in order to believe. I believe in order to understand. For I also believe that unless I believe, I shall not understand. So this is a theme in Anselm's thought. What's the main point I want to focus on there? Something he just said. Credo ut intelligam. Or it's rendered in English. I believe so that, or in order to understand. Now, the modern scientific mind, I've seen people read this and get outraged by it. What did he just say? I want to say that again. I do not seek to understand in order to believe. I believe what he said there in order to understand. So what's the issue here? He's saying, I'm not going to be objective. I'm not stepping outside. I'm not a skeptic. I'm not going to stand. I already believe this. So he's saying, I'm already a committed Christian. I already believe this. However, you can't get this stuff about God unless you already believe it. You're not going to understand it rightly. This is not, and he's not telling you, this is not him telling you, be a Christian too. Like, he's not trying to convince you of that. He's just saying, you're not going to get this unless you understand this. Which is important to the rest of everything he's about to say. Okay, but so he just says, I'm starting from this position. This is a presupposition and a presumption that I have. Remember, he's not saying this to also be indignant here or me, but like, you can't get this unless you're already on the team. So, help me understand it better. Okay, so what I want to focus on here are the next 4 chapters in Anselm here, because this is something that people will wrestle with really until Immanuel Kant, who dies in 1804, to give you an idea of how long this is going to stick around as a strong. It's still around. I've seen the remodulations of this in the 20th and 21st centuries. What do we got? What does he say? Okay, chapter 2. And this scale will come back. This is chapter 2 of the Proslogia. So I'm going to read it as is in English, and then let's see if what we can get at it. Therefore, I already said what my mission is. I want to understand God better. I already believe it, but I want to understand it. But you don't have to convince me of like what it is. I got it. How do I understand it more fully? This thing that I already believe. Therefore, Lord, you who grant understanding to faith, grant that, insofar as you know it is useful to me, I may understand that you exist as we believe you exist, and that you are what we believe you to be. Now, we believe. Now, here he gives his definition of God. What is God? So, what is God? God is aliquid quo maius nihil cogitari potest. Or, as it says here in English, you are something than which nothing greater can be thought. What? What does that mean? That's a very peculiar way of speaking, even in Latin. You are what? Nothing greater. We believe that you are something than which nothing greater can be thought. Okay. There's a scale of being, right? Could anything be higher or have more being than God? No. So that's all it means so far. Like, there's that scale of being. We can put nothing higher on the list. We can't. Now, someone might object and say, I could think of things better. Shh. No, you can't. In terms of this being like this, because that's what he means by greatest, has the most being. Okay, it doesn't mean like the best thing you like. Because you're like, I can think of, That's not what he means by being. I've heard people take it that way. Like, that he has the most being. Okay, grant that. So can it be, then he asks this question, so can it be that no such being exists? Because there are people that say, and he quotes the Psalms here, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Are there not atheists? Are there not people who say that God doesn't exist? How could they say that if God's the greatest thing, that is, the God has the most being? How could they deny that feature? But when this same fool hears me say, something than which nothing greater can be thought, he surely understands what he hears, and what he understands exists in his understanding. I'm not sure about his terminology here, but here's what he's saying. Okay, God's the being, the greatest being. So an atheist or someone that doesn't believe in God would say, that being doesn't exist. All right? So they're denying that. But when they hear me say the word God, they get it. All right. That's the framework so far. Now, this argument's very complicated, so I want to see if it clicks for you here in terms of at least where he goes with it. So again, we've established these principles. God's the greatest being. An atheist says that greatest being doesn't exist, but they get the word God. They get the concept. God's the greatest being, sure. He surely understands what he hears, for it's one thing for an object to exist in the understanding, and quite another that the object exists in reality. And he gives this example that's a very Platonic example. He says it's very different for an idea to exist in the imagination than it is for something to exist in reality. Okay, there's a difference between you imagining yourself as a millionaire and you being a millionaire, yes? One exists in reality. Or one could exist in reality. You being a millionaire. I'm even using that word being there. Existing in reality. That's different from me imagining it. Me imagining it doesn't make it so. Okay, like the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. Okay, oh no, there is. Because I imagined it. Alright, so he says that. But then, he says this. For if it exists only in the understanding, it can be thought to exist of in reality as well. It can be thought of as existing in reality as well. It could happen. Okay, like yourself as a millionaire, like that could happen. Probably not in this economy, but it could. It's not impossible. The idea is not itself self-contradictory. But this is also a special instance. God is the greatest thing that exists. And if that's true, so if that which a greater cannot be thought exists only in the understanding, then that which is a greater cannot be thought is that then which a greater can be thought. But that's clearly impossible. Now, those of you who've had me for logic before, I know it's a precious few of you, he just made an indirect proof. What do you do in an indirect proof? So what you do, and you probably remember the terminology from geometry if you haven't had me for logic. Okay, and you probably tried to forget it, right? So what you do in an indirect proof is you say, all right, we want to reach a conclusion. So how do we get to the conclusion? By saying, all right, we'll go with the opposite's true. So we'll just play around with that for a moment. And then if the opposite's true, we realize that leads to ridiculous results. So we can say, okay, the thing that we said at the beginning, that's false. So we can go with what I was saying in the first place. You've done this even colloquially if you've ever had a conversation with somebody and you go, yeah, but if that's true, that's like saying, and then you say something ridiculous. That's what you're doing. You're making an indirect proof. Or a reductio ad absurdum, if we want to go with the Latin phrasing. Here, he just said this. All right, let's review the premises again. God's the greatest being, right? An atheist says God doesn't exist. But God is the greatest being. So when an atheist says God does not exist, he's saying the greatest being is the greatest being and is not the greatest being. That doesn't make any sense. So atheism hereby is therefore, according to Onset, absurd. In the sense of being intrinsically ridiculous. Because it contains a contradiction. According to Onset. He's not done. You can't think of God not existing. You're like, I can really do that easily. Not really. Because he says this. This being exists so truly that it cannot be thought not to exist. For it is possible to think that something exists that cannot be thought not to exist. Such a being is greater than one that can be thought not to exist. By greater there, he means it has more being. Which is more real? Something that exists in pretend or something that really exists? something that really exists. God really does. And it's not merely because the misinterpretation here might be, oh, so I can think it, therefore it exists. So I'm thinking that God's real, so that means he's real. And this other person, and it's actually in your text too, this person named Gunilo writes on someone and says, well, guess what? I'm imagining a perfect island in my head. That doesn't mean it's out in the ocean somewhere. And Anselm writes back to him and says, I'm not talking about islands. I'm not talking about tables. I'm not talking about chairs. I'm talking about God. And God is a special case. So some people have accused this argument of being fallacious by being an example of special pleading. God's different. Like we can talk about anything else. The notion of God is different. It doesn't work the way normal things do. And that's, Anselm would say, because God, and he just said it there in that opening line, he said, God exists so truly. What does that mean? God is and this goes back to something that we saw in Ibn Sina as well. God is a necessary being. And I said, what does that mean? God must exist. That's what Anselm is stressing here. God must exist. So, well, let's imagine God not existing. You can't, because then the universe wouldn't exist and you wouldn't be here to think about it. Full stop. Yeah, but let's just imagine, you can't do it. Or if you do, like, well, let's just pretend for a moment creation never happened. Well, then you're living in a ridiculous universe that doesn't make sense. It would collapse in its own absurdity. It doesn't work. God is a necessary being. That is what Anselm is telling us. And he says it over and over again. And sometimes he does it in sentences that are mental gymnastics, like when he says this, therefore, if that than which a greater cannot be thought can be thought not to exist, then that which a greater cannot be thought is not then that which a greater cannot be thought, and this is a contradiction. So that then which a greater cannot be thought exists so truly, he said it again, that it cannot be thought not to exist. Whew, that's a tough sentence to say, English or Latin. But what he's getting at is this, the concept of God not existing, if God is the best thing that exists, doesn't make any sense. It is automatically self-contradictory. It's like saying a triangle that doesn't have three sides. That's not a thing. He's saying it's exactly like that. It's a self-contradictory notion. How then could someone say it? The next chapter there. Then how could someone say this? If it's so obviously self-contradictory. How then has he said in his heart what he could not think? Or how could he not think what he said in his heart? How could he do this? Because he's a fool. And a fool here is it's not just a matter of intellection or thinking. He just doesn't think of this. You just can't get it. You wouldn't get it. You can't get it. And you can't get it because he already said this at the beginning. Whose help do I need in order to understand this in the first place? Me. I need God's help. Without this kind of revelation, I'd never come to this conclusion. But what he wants to get at is here, and again, this is not meant as some evangelical tool. And by that I mean, he's not saying, here's how you can get more Christians. Tell people this. Okay? He's saying, when I, as a Christian, contemplate this stuff, this is what I'm thinking about. That the concept of God's existence is in the concept. I don't have to go out and do anything. This doesn't require scientific research. Just, even if you think about the word God long enough, you'll get it. If you just contemplate on it, because that's what he's asking us to do here. Or at least that's what he's asking us for Christians to do here. That's what he's asking them to do. But this becomes an important theme. And this is, by the way, what he just did. This kind of argument for existence of God, where you just look at the concept, this is called an ontological argument. So ontology is just the study of being. The ontological argument is the argument for the existence of God that relies on the concept alone. God exists. Just look at what it means. The concept of God. You'll figure it out. Now he writes other books too. Cur Deus Homo, on the incarnation. It's a bit more theological than philosophical. But this notion of the ontological argument, just think about the concept of God, and you'll get it. It's going to persist. We'll see it in René Descartes. You'll see it in the 21st century, the modal ontological argument. It's very complicated.